G'day there. You're watching the Aussie BIM Guru, and today I'm going to be talking about a complex topic and one that not necessarily everyone will receive well, I'm sure. Some people will agree with it, some people won't. But I'm going to be discussing whether Dynamo, especially for Revit, is becoming a little bit too difficult for the average user to manage. So Dynamo for Revit is great. I've obviously had a lot of videos on my channel about it. Some people might have noticed I probably am not using it as much as I used to, and my videos don't always fall back to it. And that is because it is becoming difficult to manage, particularly at a company scale. Now, I want to stipulate it's not impossible to manage Dynamo. There are many ways to do it, but I think the less time you put into it, or the less time you have available, the less feasible it becomes as a scaled solution. Now, I don't know if Dynamo was ever really intended to be a fully scaled solution at companies, but it's certainly being marketed and offered that way by some of the experts or the people managing Dynamo, and I think it can actually work that way, but often companies would be better off developing things like add-ins eventually, and I think most Dynamo experts would probably agree with that sentiment. Having said that, not every company has the liberty of having those types of people available or their time available all the time, so Dynamo can be a great way to get around that limitation. But I'll be discussing today, I guess, the current state of Dynamo for Revit, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and then how people are managing Dynamo at scale, and some of the challenges that come with that. And of course, beyond that, my verdict on sort of where Dynamo is going, how I see its future shaping up, and also what I recommend to people that might be trying to make it scale, maybe without the luck that they were hoping for. So there's a lot of great things about Dynamo. It's not all bad news by any means. In fact, there's actually heaps of good news, heaps of great stuff going on in the community, a lot of really passionate and interested users, and a great support team from Autodesk that actually does still support Dynamo pretty much just like they have this whole time. So there's a lot of really passionate users in the community, but also people from Autodesk, not only moderating the forums, but also the GitHub, and also trying to communicate with the community. I would say the Dynamo team probably does a much better job at communicating with the community than probably nearly any other community at Autodesk in the AEC collection really does. Some products it's almost radio silence. I mean, Navisworks, for example, who's really listening to that anymore. But Dynamo's really got a great and open community, and I do have to commend particularly Solomore and Jacob Small, who do a fantastic job at the forums, and Sol obviously is doing a great job keeping the community posted. There's a lot of really passionate users, people that really still love promoting Dynamo, even if they don't necessarily use it all the time in their 9 to 5. Probably people like myself who still try to promote it as a resource to learn programming through, but maybe not necessarily master programming, especially in the Revit API. But there is undoubtedly a strong, growing, and stable community. It's used in a lot of AEC firms, even large ones. The firm I work at, we've used Dynamo for various things over the years. Often we use it for what I call prototype solutions, things that don't necessarily have to be the final product. And also we also use it just on project-specific solutions, where it's much easier to pump out a quick solution in Dynamo than go and write a fully fledged add-in at the cost of a project, which you usually can't afford. So it still has some fantastic use cases, and AEC firms are certainly justified in investing and using this product, given that it comes with Revit as part of Revit now anyway. So if you're not using it, you're basically probably wasting your time by not looking into it further. There's a lot of custom packages, many of them still very much active, some very passionate users that are really trying their hardest to make this thing work. I have to give a shout out to John Pearson, obviously probably the most involved one. Of course, we have Thomas as well with Bimorph nodes, Albin with Genius Loci. There are some really strong, well-supported packages with people who also support the community in turn, and probably do have a very positive and constructive mindset, probably more so than my own sometimes, that are really pushing this forward as well. So I have to commend them. Of course, Dynamo's not going away anytime soon. Autodesk has signaled to us they're invested in developing this, integrating it into other environments such as Forma and Civil 3D. So there's some very good things going on. There's some things that maybe aren't necessarily ugly, but might be indicating or erring on the side of bad things ahead, or bad things we're already dealing with. We have to acknowledge Dynamo for Revit is I believe it's over 10 years old now. And with that does come a lot of challenges and a lot of flavors of Dynamo. So currently, Dynamo for Revit isn't really backwards compatible as it comes. You do have to do a lot of workarounds, use some helper utilities, some resources developed by the community to take scripts back to old versions. There are some things that Dynamo builds just don't have between versions, so sometimes it can be difficult if you're hanging back in an older version of Revit, which we get stuck in often, and Dynamo is tied to Revit now as well, so you can't just take a modern implementation of Dynamo and port it back to an old Revit. It's not really possible, it's not naturally possible. You can do it, I believe, but it comes with a lot of risk. As well as this, Revit itself has API deprecation and addition. For example, there's been a lot of forge unit types that have changed in the latest version of Revit that have caused a lot of nodes and implementations and workflows and scripts and examples to no longer really quite work the same way. So there's a lot of changes that come that can make it a really confusing and difficult journey. Now, that's not really the fault of Dynamo or the fault of Revit. That's just the nature of software progression. Things do have to move forward, but it does make things challenging, especially for people trying to jump into Dynamo, looking at old resources in most cases. There's some UI, UX, user experience challenges that often do come from the changing appearance of Dynamo, additional features being added, and it can create a very jarring experience between different builds of Revit. For example, Dynamo Player is much better in 2023 and beyond, and looks very different before that. So when you're trying to train people in Dynamo or build a consistent experience for them, if they're not in one build of Revit, it can be a very confusing experience for them. And of course, there's the ugly. There are some things that really are, I think, significant challenges in implementing Dynamo in its current state. Some of these don't have easy solutions, or maybe don't have solutions. They're just something that comes with using Dynamo. One of the biggest problems I see with Dynamo is that there is a lot of unsupported content and packages that are ultimately dead on the package manager. No one is managing them. A majority of the time, their contents probably won't work because they're just simply going to be out of date. I think there definitely needs to be a review, and the community managers are well aware of this in Dynamo, have been told, are looking into it, that there needs to be a way to start superseding some of this stuff that is just so old that it's not reliable in the custom package manager anymore. Some of the pioneers of Dynamo, whilst they're not gone altogether, they're off doing different things, are no longer around to maintain some of the legacy that they've left. For example, the Archilab package is loosely supported now by Conrad Sobon, who wrote it. He used to be a mainstay on the Dynamo forums, and I don't believe he's posted there for years now. He does still have a blog, of course, but I think that some of those pioneer users have definitely fragmented and had to move on from the Dynamo for the most part. So I think that does leave a little bit of an absence in the community and also in the support for some of those mainstay packages. I think Dynamo itself, and this is a controversial opinion, is getting a little bit saturated. A lot of people are learning it because it just is something that they feel like they have to learn, not because they want to, and they're coming in with a very lazy attitude to learning Dynamo. We see people on the forums constantly come in and say, hey, I need a script and I need it to do this. And most people just send them straight to the rules of the forum and say, I'm sorry, this isn't how the forums work. You've actually got to do some work and then we can help you. But we're seeing a lot more people that really just come in and expect people to do things for them. And honestly, I'll just tell them to nick off. Like, go try harder, come back after you've done some research, and then we help you. But I think as programs get more and more accepted by the industry, you start to get these types of users that unfortunately are always going to be quite rude and quite expectant. Some of it's a language barrier sometimes. It's not necessarily them being rude, it's just them not quite understanding the way the forums work. But I am noticing this becoming a more problematic aspect of not just managing the forums, but also just the types of people that I'm engaging with using Dynamo are maybe expecting too much too soon. As well as this, the package manager is, I wouldn't say it's very fresh, but the Dynamo does depend a lot on its custom packages to really enhance its experience. So there are some challenges that come with that, related to the fact that there are a lot of dead packages floating around that people don't really get any support for anymore. And the final issue, which I'll probably talk about in a bit more depth in this video, is a really difficult one, and that is that I think as of Revit 2023, IronPython 2.7 support was dropped for a variety of valid reasons, but as a result, a lot of custom packages just no longer work without an additional package installed, which has some very confusing, maybe concerning messaging around it from Autodesk, in that they basically say don't install this, it's a security risk, but a majority of the resources that Dynamo depends on still really depend on a pretty outdated Python engine, I'll be honest. Whilst there is a new Python engine, CPython 3, as of partway through 2021's Dynamo version, there are some things that CPython 3 just cannot really do naturally, or cannot do easily without some serious gymnastics in Python, the same way that we used to be able to do. Now, those things are fringe cases. They're not like the majority of things. For the most part, most stuff works in CPython 3 in a very similar way to the way it did before. It's just that not everything is an easy approach, especially when looking at all the legacy packages and how they solve problems in IronPython 2.7. So I will talk about that a little bit more, but to me they're like the uglier sides of Dynamo and how it's becoming challenging. Though, like I said before, Dynamo can certainly be managed at a company scale with a lot of catches and caveats. The average user in AEC these days, unfortunately, I found just isn't really that interested in learning Dynamo and other programs at a technical level. They're really just interested in saving themselves time and getting back to their job. So really, you do need to invest in a team that can manage these solutions properly, otherwise it really falls apart. I think you have to either invest in a solution that will maintain your scripts and packages across different versions in different states, for example, Orchestra for Dynamo. You might also need, or alternatively in a medium scale company, need an IT team that is willing to help you deploy folders with packages that you may need to support your scripts automatically and regularly, so that when someone runs a script they know it's going to work. Or you can just not use packages at all, but obviously then be limited by what Dynamo can do in the build you work in. Or you can use Python natively, but then you might hit some other issues that we'll talk about a bit later relating to Python across different Dynamo builds. As well as this, you really do need to test in all the builds you want to support Dynamo in. You can't just build a script in 2020 or 2022 and assume it's going to work perfectly in every other version, because chances are it probably won't. You're going to ideally probably end up building scripts that support certain versions of Revit to make it easier, or maybe to deal with certain groups of Revit. For example, 2022 to 2023 is a pretty big change, and I'd usually recommend people build scripts either side of that fence to deal with the Python issue that we run into a bit later. As well as this, ideally you're going to have to avoid certain types of nodes that don't work well between versions of Revit. For example, if you're specifying a category by name, such as walls, you're better off using the category by name node rather than a dropdown, unless you know the user is going to engage with the dropdown, because between builds, more options fall into those dropdowns and offset the category it points to by default. As well as this, you're going to have to train your users and make them comfortable with errors sometimes. Dynamo is not a perfect solution. It is a low-level sort of solution for programming, and with that will sometimes come errors that you can't really avoid unless you write scripts in a very sophisticated way. So you have to make sure your users are comfortable dealing with something that occasionally isn't always going to work. Otherwise, they lose confidence in this and just won't use it. So how can we divert away from Dynamo at scale? That's one option we can look at. Just don't use it. What alternatives are there? Well, you can sort of half use it, half not, by burying these scripts inside toolbars to make them more approachable for users. For example, you can use tools like Relay, an open source option, Nonica, Orchestra, other programs that can deploy these scripts at scale to your company using add-ins that make them more presentable. You can of course do this in PyRevit as well, or you can simply just build scripts in Python. That's become my solution, at least where I work right now, and it's working quite well. It will run into some challenges in future, especially when Revit 2025 comes along, but for now it's been a great alternative to Dynamo, as long as you're comfortable with writing tools in that way, and of course deploying PyRevit and custom toolbars around your company with the help of IT, which luckily I get. You can of course just also develop add-ins that you can install on your users' computers in C#, and obviously this is probably a great solution if your company can afford it, because the speed you're going to get and the performance and stability is going to be pretty much unmatchable by things like Python and Dynamo. Having said that, you can write tools in PyRevit that are usually fairly stable, but you have to build them very carefully, and they are generally just going to be slower than C# based solutions. As well as this, you can of course develop in-house custom packages for Dynamo, libraries of code that you can draw into your scripts, and of course zero-touch nodes as well in those custom packages. If you wish to at least try and use Dynamo but with your own company's flavor applied to it. And of course, you're still going to need help deploying all those resources around the company. The point is there's options, but they all come with catches and things to consider. There is just a simple reality at scale. I usually tell people that Dynamo for Revit will not work for their business at scale if they don't have people willing to manage it, they don't have people willing to invest in training their users, they just expect something that works off the shelf. If they depend on other people to install dependencies and packages to make scripts work that we're giving them, and of course if they're not willing to test things before new releases come out. If you don't do these 5 things, Dynamo for Revit is not for your business. Buy add-ins, buy programs built by other people, and simply don't worry about it. That's usually my advice. But if you're willing to invest into this, your company will probably get some benefit from using Dynamo, at least as your initial foray into automation for Revit. Now this is a big one, and this is a difficult one to talk about without necessarily maybe annoying people, or maybe just appearing a little bit ignorant of the realities of what it takes to build a program like Dynamo and support it. But a lot of custom packages in Dynamo use Python. There's not really much escaping it. You can, of course, just move to C# and do away with a lot of these challenges. Of course, you have to learn C#, you have to build in C#, you have to use Visual Studio, you have to deploy things differently. It's a different approach, but probably a better one in the longer term. But historically, IronPython 2.7 was the implementation of Python, or the wrapper that Dynamo used in order to communicate with, I believe, the Revit API, and maybe it's Python shell. But in this case, as of Revit 2021, in a later build, CPython 3 was introduced to Dynamo, and we were told by the community at Autodesk that this was going to become the mainstay supported implementation of Python. So Revit 2022, again, we still had both. When Revit 2023 hit, things got difficult. So in this case, CPython 3 became the only default supported Python engine. So if you have a custom package written in IronPython 2.7, the nodes simply will not run by default. So even if you have the custom package installed, it's not enough. You need an extra package, which Autodesk generally recommends you don't install for security reasons. They're sort of right, but at the same time, it's hard for people to accept, especially me. Revit 2024, same thing, just CPython 3, and also some of the versions of the supporting package for IronPython don't work in that build as well. So it's getting a little bit confusing, a little bit difficult. As of Revit 2025, we've been told that Dynamo will be moving up to a new net framework as a part of modernizing Revit and other programs. It makes sense. It's about time, probably a lot of developers would say, but at the same time, I'm sure that will bring its own set of challenges. So the point is, we're starting to see that as Dynamo has become tied into the Revit build as of 2020, there have been some things that have come in, come out, and forced people to develop around them as Revit versions change. Now, there's a lot of options for how you can deal with this. There are some easy or lazy ways out. I'll be honest, I've taken one of them. You can just say, who cares? The user can figure it out, not my problem. I build a package for fun. At the end of the day, I don't have to maintain it. I think that's a bad option. I think at least communicate with people what's happening to your package. The users can install IronPython 2.7. There is still the option for now, I don't know if it's always going to be there, so that you can still support these packages at your own risk, as Autodesk says. You can also just leave the package manager altogether, go to GitHub, and hope that people figure out how to run your package without the support of the package manager. Orchid for Dynamo is a great example. I don't necessarily agree that it's always the best way to go, but it's looking like a lot of package managers might go that way if things keep up, because it is getting quite confusing using the package manager to deploy packages naturally. There's some hard ways out. One of them is just to say, goodbye Python. I'm onto CPython 3 or I'm onto C#. There are some good things that come with that and some bad things. If you go to CPython 3, your package won't work into Revit 2020. Now, Revit 2020 is quite old now, but a lot of people are still using it. I don't know if you're pirates, I don't know if you're on big old projects, probably a bit of both. Honestly, we don't want to support pirates, but we do want to support older projects if we can. But I think the reality is that eventually some of these packages will just switch to CPython 3 and say goodbye Revit 2020. That's most likely what will happen. Now, not everything works in CPython 3 the same way as IronPython 2.7. There are some limitations. There are some things that need significant complex workarounds in order to work. If you're curious to see any, I just do recommend searching CPython 3 on the forums and looking for pretty much any post by Cyril, who's probably one of our resident Python experts, who has explained some of the limitations and workarounds very clearly and succinctly. As well as this, there are some community updates from Autodesk, from the team, that do actually admit there will be challenges, there will be some limitations, and they're working on them. As well as this, you can also split your package into multiple flavors or builds. Some packages that have done this include Clockwork, which has a 1.x and a 2.x and maybe a 3.x eventually, once Dynamo hits 3.x. There are other packages such as Archilab that have chosen to use their sub-builds as an indicator of the version you should install each build for. Quite a lot of work. Some package managers have just went to C# or been there for quite a while and it's not a big deal for them, like Bimorph nodes. And some, as a third alternative, have decided to build their own custom installation routines into their package that trigger on install from the package manager. The only one that I know that's done this at the moment is Rhythm for Dynamo by John Pearson. And it was a significant challenge to overcome from what I could see. It looks like he did a fantastic job. It's an amazing thing to do. And obviously, probably arguably the person who's most passionate about their Dynamo package is John Pearson, which makes sense. So I think that the point is that there are ways out, but they take work, they take effort, they take communication. Things are starting to get a little bit fragmented. But there it is anyway. There are some options, but there are some serious challenges. And a lot of them do just go back to the package manager, right? That's the big problem. I might quickly just show the IronPython 2.7 workaround so people are aware of it. But effectively, if you're in Dynamo and you're using a custom package such as mine, which does depend on IronPython 2.7, a very easy way to check that is to open a node and look for a Python node, and you'll see very clearly IronPython 2 is one of the specified engines in use. You can go to search for a package, and you can search for IronPython once it loads. And we'll see here Dynamo IronPython 2.7. Now you're not going to want to hit install straight away. You're going to want to go to view details 2.5. That's the build I recommend installing if you're in Revit currently. These apparently aren't going to work unless you're in a Dynamo 3.x version, whereas 2.5 is the last build that supports Dynamo 2.x builds, from what I understand. I could be wrong, but I believe that that's at least what's happened recently. But once you have this package installed, it will in turn be able to run and support custom nodes using Python. Now, a lot of packages still use IronPython. Some very big ones, for example, Spring Nodes and Genius Loci, are both still using IronPython as far as I know. So there is still a lot, and also data shapes. There are just some packages where I assume the package managers either don't have time or have decided they'd prefer to support more versions of Revit and just stay the way they are, rather than introducing the confusion of using two different Python engines. So it is a serious problem and challenge to face. Not one that Autodesk hid from us, right? They did tell us it was coming, so I'm not attacking them by any means, but it's just one that as a community we have to be conscious of and talk about and find solutions to together. So in wrapping this discussion all up, which I hope has been interesting and insightful for people that aren't aware of it, and maybe helps the discussion for people that are, I think that if you are hoping to run Dynamo at scale in your company, unless you want to put in the investment to support it realistically, I don't think you should expect to use Dynamo at scale in your company, full stop. I don't think it's going to become that much easier to deploy or scale. I think it's actually getting it harder as more builds come out in future and as the flavor of Dynamo changes as well. Dynamo is a fantastic way to learn about programming for Revit in particular and the Revit API, but it is a great entry point, and I think for a lot of people that is what it will become and remain. It will become a prototyping environment, somewhere you can test things out, but maybe not the only place you do it. And I think realistically, if you are a developer, you shouldn't expect for it to become more than that. It really is honestly aware of its limitations and embraces them. And I think that the community makes people aware of that as well. I think the custom package situation with both the Python issue, but more importantly, the old, dead, unsupported packages issue is probably not going to be solved too soon, as far as I'm aware. But I think it will become a bigger issue as time goes on and as less people are around to support legacy content. And it will ultimately, in either case, lead to less useful resources. So I think it's a major issue. It has to be solved at some point by the community and the team. They're all aware of it, but I guess I'm just making anyone using Dynamo aware that this is becoming a fairly big issue. I think regardless, if you are a developer, just be conscious that at some point in your programming journey, you should expect to jump into either C# if you're comfortable, or learn more Python, switch to PyRevit, and maybe that might be your bridge to C#, or maybe it's enough for you. But just be aware that really Dynamo is probably the intermediary environment to get to bigger and better things, especially if you're at a company that's going to need bigger and better things. So just be aware of this, and I hope that it's been a positive and constructive discussion, and maybe helps frame my own perspective around Dynamo and how it's changing. But yeah, it is a confusing and challenging thing to overcome and deal with, so there's a breakdown of it. As always, you can find all the resources I create over on my GitHub, but I guess I hope that this has been an interesting, useful, and enlightening discussion for some of you. I hope to hear from people down in the comments or just from people directly about this topic if they're interested in it and how they can contribute. If people want to help the Dynamo community in dealing with this, over on the Dynamo forums, there's a lot of places where you can contribute. They do have some threads talking about the future of Dynamo. There are some great threads by John Pearson in particular, talking about how he's had to consider his own package with Rhythm and how he's had to tackle it. I'll put it down in the comments below because I think it's a great read and really does expand on what I've spoken about. But I hope that it's been an interesting topic. If you're not already following and subscribing, feel free to do so. I look forward to seeing you in future similar videos. Thanks. Take care. Bye.